So we already attempted Halo 3 without turning, and we all know how that went, but essentially playing through a Halo game without using the right analog stick to look around really can impact the way you experience the game. And Halo 3 had its own troubles and tribulation, and we thought, why don't we go back to Halo 2 and see if we can travel through the fire and flames on expert difficulty, Halo 2 edition, where we can't actually turn around. And boy, is this game something else here. Starting things off, we were on Cairo Station, and right away we learned a big issue that would play kind of a massive role into how Halo 2 is played if you can't touch the turn stick. Some of the weapons in Halo 2 have a type of recoil that doesn't eventually bring you back down to where you're aiming, so if you choose to shoot a gun a bunch, eventually you might be looking in a completely different direction. And I learned that immediately with the SMG, and since we're already limited as to what we can see to use to even navigate through a level, staring upwards or in an angle that's not really fit for traveling or navigating around a Halo 2 mission isn't really the best strategy, though we did keep it in the back of our head just in case it may be something we need to rely on later on if maybe we're pointed downwards and we need to try to even out our field of view. Now, there is another thing that's really interesting in Halo 2 that seemed different from our Halo 3 run, where essentially in Halo 2, if you see an enemy close up, there is of course the aim assist type function, or that thing that drags the camera along with the enemy, which is supposed to help you aim your gun. However, we did notice the pull in Halo 2 is quite different from the one in Halo 3, and almost seemed heavier at times just at looking at the enemies. So this might be something also that we noticed during our run on Cairo Station to play with, because we're able to kind of angle ourselves based off of where the enemies are running by. Now, for the level itself, it was pretty straightforward. We are very familiar with this level, unfortunately, because we of course had done the speed run under 3 hours and we had to master Cairo Station, and also we did the overall lasso level of this. So as far as navigating rooms go, we did have an easy-ish time knowing the general route, though when you're walking down a hallway you've never walked through backwards before, it can get a little disorienting, and trying to navigate around which staircase you're at or where in the level you are is really confusing. We definitely ran into the most problems when we were in the outside space section. There's just a lot going on and you have to kind of just navigate through this big massive open area. With the elevator room where all the buggers were, the main strategy I used was just to run ahead while Luke tried to see what he could navigate around and make my way into that lower room that you exit the room for before the entire elevator starts making its way up, so we wouldn't get stuck with any awkward button presses. Because if you remember to our Halo 3 video, if you aren't lined up perfectly for a button, you can be completely messed up in your entire run, and you could be stuck there respawning over and over and over again, hoping to get the right angle just to press a button to let you progress through the level. So I tried to rush through this one and it worked out here, and Luke was able to spawn on me. But in the outside section here, where all the enemies are, super disorienting, especially with the platform dropping and raising again. But nonetheless, we did make our way through this area and into the last elevator room that takes you to where all the elites are and where the bomb is. Clearing the room was interesting. We were a little worried that some of the elites would just assassinate us since we're running at them with our backs towards them. Fortunately enough, though, we did clear this level, so we're feeling optimistic, but we know how challenging Halo 2 gets in later levels, so it was only going to be an uphill battle from here. Jumping into Outskirts, we were surprised with how much we are able to navigate the rooftops just based off of sheer memory, because honestly, you don't have any real indicators telling you where to go or how to travel. But honestly, nonetheless, as long as we're able to make our way through the rooftops and make that one jump from the bridge to that upper level, we were doing really well. We traveled through the hotel and Luke made his way over to the beach where the ghost was, and he was able to just kind of navigate that ghost through the level the best he could, despite not being able to turn the camera. And this is kind of the main strategy we used for the whole level of Outskirts, just because for the most part you can ride your ghost all the way till the end of the level through all the tunnels and avoid the enemies the best you can, as long as you're okay with being very patient, because driving a ghost sideways is very, very slow, especially if you get stuck going backwards, and since the tunnel is windy, it can get really annoying at times. Metropolis actually wasn't too bad jumping into it. I got a chance to drive the tank a little bit, and I realized the tank is incredibly great for this challenge in Halo 2, as it pretty much is really easy to choose where you are going or which direction you're going. You always feel like you can see where you're going, and you can at least reset your camera if you want to jump out of the tank and then jump back in the tank and face the correct direction as long as the tank body is facing the right way. So it is a little trick where you can readjust the camera as needed, though the tank doesn't play too big of a role on this level, though it is something to remember for later levels. Otherwise, for the most part, we're just kind of blindly navigating our way through the inside tunnels and back outside again, traveling through the streets of New Mombasa, Halo 2 style. We kind of bumped into some things along the way. When we got to the Scarab, it was really interesting because just trying to time and figure out when and how to land on the Scarab is incredibly difficult when you can't actually look at where you're going. And we ended up just deciding to wait for the Scarab to make it all the way to the end where it stopped walking before we tried to even board the Scarab in the first place, because we just kept falling off the map. And that seemed to be the best way to carry on through that. Okay, so we were really confident about the next level with the Arbiter. We knew this level really well. We were feeling good overall, but once we got inside, we immediately fell off into these gaps that are kind of at the end of this weird conveyor belt energy thing. And I actually fell down it multiple times, which was great. We were a little concerned though, because when you do make it to the bottom section, typically you're not facing the correct direction, and hitting the elevator button can be challenging, though if you hit the elevator button either using through the wall or you're lined up correctly to hit the button, you will lower into the next area. And fortunately enough, I had a good angle where I was able to line myself up and open the big door to let the ship come in, which was something we also were worried about because Luke did not have the right angle, but for whatever reason I was lined up based on how the aim assist aligned me. And that was kind of one of the interesting things throughout this run that we noticed, is that sometimes Luke and I would have different alignments just on which enemies we chose to maybe punch or get close up to, or accidentally get too close to, and it would mess up our alignment. Though we did find out that if we died and respawned on each other, we would be facing the same direction as the player who was being spawned on. At the very least, if one of us had a better angle, we could duplicate that for both players, but we have yet to find a sure strategy to actually get us to turn freely without using the turn button, other than the occasional time we have the tank. We navigated down those tight hallways through the rest of this level and made our way out to where the Banshees are, and we were able to fly the Banshee over to the end of the level, though we did run into a small issue where the Banshee is a little tricky to actually fly here, though since it was a mostly straightforward flight with a little veering to the right, we didn't have to turn too much, so we were able to navigate over there without too many problems. But if the Banshee is going to be required for other parts of other levels, it might get trickier down the road. Then we jumped onto the Oracle, one of our personal least favorite levels in all of Halo, so this was a blast. Honestly, we just had to ride the elevator down, which took forever. Because of the way we were angled, we had to walk down that hallway backwards, and then we kind of were just stuck in that firefight room waiting and killing the enemies until that door finally opened, letting us go outside. We made our way into the main section building, where we typically like to climb up and do an elevator glitch that allows one player to super launch up into the upper area where all of those cables are. However, just making our way up the spiral platform to get up to where the elevator is to begin with was challenging enough, not being able to actually look down and see where we were. We felt like we were constantly falling off and having to start all over, plus there's enemies everywhere knocking us back constantly, and even if we did get up to the elevator, there's enemies shooting at us while we're up there too, making it just a bit more challenging. Nonetheless, we did eventually pull that super bounce off, though for whatever reason, once I launched up there, I kind of just fell off the map and died. I wasn't really too sure what was going on. Another time, Luke managed to get launched as well, or something happened and he was up in the upper area too, like it teleported him. So our invincibility glitch that we typically use on things like the speedrun or lasso wasn't going to work, but we thought we could still play through this normally, though I kept respawning outside of bounds for whatever reason and dying, so it was all up to Luke to chop those cables, and he had some trouble navigating around and trying to figure out how to walk without seeing if you're about to walk off the edge. And it became this big thing of just memorizing a route where he could walk, hit all the cables. Fortunately, you can hit the cables from either side, which is a huge relief, and then he could make his way back to the middle. Now, we did have a little moment of panic when he made it back to the middle and he didn't know what to do to get the elevator to move again, though it just turned out the button wasn't working the first time. You just had to wait a minute and then the button started working. From there, we made our way down to the lower sections while everything was in the free fall thing, and we kind of just slowly navigated our way, and then we ran into a massive problem after we walked through the main pathways and we got to the part where you are very briefly in a Banshee. Now, typically in this level, you literally fly a Banshee for maybe 10 seconds, and it's super easy. But because we couldn't turn the Banshees, we were stuck facing the wrong way with the platforms falling, and the game has this moving death barrier that continuously closes in, and you have to stay within reach of the falling platforms or else you'll instantly be killed. Also, if you jump out of the Banshee early, instantly killed as well. So we were stuck facing the wrong way, trying to figure out how to turn the Banshee, and for whatever reason in Halo 2, the Banshees are really difficult to rotate or turn. Fortunately enough, while I consistently was dying, Luke found this weird way of flipping and spinning and kind of hitting different walls to start to angle his Banshee, and he had a couple of successful times where at least he was facing something different, but still we weren't able to see where we were supposed to go, before he finally had one where, luckily enough, he just saw where he was supposed to go and land, and he was able to make it over there, bringing us on to the next section of this level, where we had to run through more corridors, making our way to the boss fight, which we anticipated also to be incredibly hard, but the boss fight was surprisingly easy. We just kind of sword spammed him and we're good to go. Delta Halo was another level we're really familiar with, but we don't have our skulls that let us just do crazy grenade jumps or speed runs or things that we typically do on Lasso, so we had to kind of do the level a little bit more normally, though it wasn't too bad. We kind of sidestepped, walked through things, figured out how to lower the bridge. I took the tank, which was really fun, even though it was much slower than Luke just bouncing off the walls walking. And he did try out a Wraith a little bit to see what it was like. We pushed on into the middle temple, which was a little disorienting, and the Jackal snipers in the later section of this level are terrifying, though manageable. And while we were nervous about those honor guards that are typically on the inside, especially if we're walking into this room sideways, we could just be assassinated easily. I managed to kill him without any problem, and this level was actually one of the shorter ones in this run, though the next level, Regret, did pose some problems. Now, we were just going to play through this level normally, but when you get to the main platform area, you typically have to wait around for all this extra stuff to come through, like hunters to drop in that you typically have to fight, and honestly, it was just a lot of extra challenges that we typically fly past whenever we're doing any other type of challenge. So we wanted to see if we could find a way to launch ourselves over to the area that lets you skip the hunter fight and just jump straight on the gondola to bypass a bunch of the level. We tried doing the typical grenade jump that usually works better with Sputnik, even though we didn't have Sputnik here, and we couldn't seem to pull it off doing it this weird sideways direction. So what we ended up practicing over and over again, even on our live stream, people who were there can attest to it, was we jumped on Luke's head and he sidestepped off the platform, and I used that to try to get a running jump and to land on the bridge. This took a ton of tries, but it beat grenade jumping. Eventually, with enough trial and error, I did make it onto the lower platform, though even if you do make it to the lower platform, you still can't just jump up and get up to the higher platform. You usually have to do a grenade jump, and we can't just throw grenades at our feet without turning, so we ended up having to try to manipulate the respawn, which worked, to get Luke to respawn on me, and then from there, I fell off the map, Luke stayed on the platform, and then I respawned on his head, and I jumped off of his head up to the upper platform. Then Luke respawned on me, and he was able to make the leap onto the gondola. Then lastly, all we had to do to trigger the gondola to actually move was spawn the enemies that spawn in on that main platform. So I just walked backwards and stayed behind once those elites spawned, and it triggered the gondola to move. And sure enough, we'd skipped that section without turning, which was probably more challenging at that point than just fighting the hunters normally, but we felt like we accomplished something, and that's what really matters. The next part of the level was pretty straightforward. We had a little bit of trouble in the room where all of the jackals and buggers are, but we did the best we could. We had a big debate in our chat as to whether or not they were called buggers or drones canonically, and even though both are correct, we still stand by the fact that buggers are a fully acceptable and appropriate way to call those things. I mean, Veronica Dare calls them buggers, Sergeant Johnson calls them buggers, some random Marines call them buggers, and that's good enough for me. Okay, side tangent over, but we made our way through the underwater section. We were a little worried with the elevators just because you have to stand a certain way to trigger them. Fortunately enough, though, you can actually trigger the elevators from the outside of the elevator, and it won't leave until both players are standing in the elevator, so it worked out. A few long elevator and gondola rides later, though, we made our way to the boss, and Luke just killed him, like, instantly, really quickly. Like, I didn't even realize it until we were done with the level, and I was like, oh look, we're done. So that was cool. So next we jumped into Sacred Icon, and honestly, this level was way more intense than we had initially expected. We thought, since this level is relatively a shorter level, it doesn't really stand out as a difficult level per se in Halo 2, but for whatever reason, if you're trying to navigate these tight hallways and these dark corridors and these random ledges that you have to either jump over or walk along, it is so confusing when you're trying to go through it without turning. Seriously, this one was a struggle, and actually at one point we thought this would maybe be the level that would kill us, because there were sections where we would just continuously get lost, walk in circles, get blown up by the flood, which adds this whole extra level of stress when you're trying to navigate hallways. And we were getting really bad checkpoints, reverting further and further back. Seriously, even on lower difficulties, this level was intense, but it kind of just became one of these things where we had to just keep pushing through and make our way from one checkpoint to the next checkpoint. And this last corridor where the popcorn flood is and they just explode, it was just trial and error pretty much. We didn't have any extra strategy other than jumping and hoping that we didn't die in the process until we finally made it past that. When we did finally get to the outdoor section, it was a little bit better, especially with how chaotic the tight corridors were. And from there, it was just a smooth firefight holdout section where we just kind of sat there for a while and waited till the Phantom came and picked us up. But otherwise, we were able to clear this level barely. Quarantine Zone was actually a little bit interesting because it is a level that you typically drive through in a vehicle. We did the best we could to carry the vehicles through as well as we could, even though we had no idea where we were going sometimes because we couldn't do the most to turn our vehicles. There was eventually a brief section where I could use the tank, which at least made it a little bit easier to push up and get a few checkpoints, but eventually you do have to leave it behind. So we were back to just kind of feeling out the level based off of memory the best that we could. Some of the vehicles are kind of terrifying, but otherwise we could make our way through this and get to the gondola ride that just takes you to the end of the level. And when we got to the gondola, we just hid in that underground section that you can just stand in and the enemies never come to you. So that was pretty nice. But then we got to Gravemind, and seriously, we have so much PTSD from this level, just from the lasso experience, the speedrun experience. We love Gravemind. It's seriously one of our favorite challenges, but it also can be a very daunting level at the same time. So we were ready for anything and ready to just spend hours on this if need be. But interestingly enough, it's probably a mix of us being very familiar with this level from both the speedrun and lasso videos, and just the fact that this level mostly is pretty linear. We did a pretty good job clearing through this section, running past most of the enemies, killing the ones that we had to. As much as we would love to do an elevator skip and bypass the whole prison section, we ended up just doing the prison section because we weren't really sure how on earth we would be able to pull something off like this otherwise. So it was kind of neat to see the prison area with, you know, out turning. It was kind of hard to drop down to certain levels, but otherwise we were getting through it okay. The outdoor sections weren't actually that hard. We did have to worry a little bit about maybe walking off the edge a couple of times, and other than that though, it was actually a pretty chill level. Uprising's another one of those levels that's kind of interesting because we're so used to playing it a certain way. Typically we do a grenade jump, break out of the map, make a run to the cliff and just crouch, but not being able to turn does make it a little bit harder to navigate. So we did go through this level mostly normal. The indoor sections were awkward at best. I kept dying, respawning, and then not knowing where I was, so that was fun, but Luke managed to push on a little bit. The ghost section is a little scuffed if you can't actually steer or turn along the way, which was interesting, but by far the biggest challenge here was this little rock bridge that you have to cross, and if you're not facing it, you fall back in and you have to walk all the way back around again, and it was just so painfully annoying every time you fell that I had to mention it at least in this video. Fortunately, Luke eventually pulled it off again, kind of carrying me through this level, but nonetheless, we were able to push through this level, giving us just a couple levels left. But seriously, some of the challenges we would have up ahead would really question our belief if we could even pull this thing off, because we know in that last level we're gonna have banshees and we're gonna have a boss fight, but first we had to get through High Charity, which we thought would be very similar to Gravemind. And matter of fact, despite the fact that there is flood there, it is a mostly straightforward level again. It's a little bit longer than we remembered if we can't turn, but we were doing pretty well. It was surprisingly easy considering how difficult Sacred Icon was, which was another level with the flood and tight corridors. But when we got to the Just Okay journey, whew, things got a little interesting. First of all, right away, we ran into some problems because we were just walking into walls and rocks and we didn't know what we were doing. I hitched a ride on a Spectre driven by some elite and he was doing good. He was taking me on through. I was feeling optimistic that this AI would carry me all the way to Tartarus directly. It wasn't the case. I actually had to get out just a minute later because he kind of started doing donuts around some enemies. Meanwhile, I think Luke was getting splattered and he was just walking around, so it wasn't really going well. We eventually did make our way to the bottom section where we had to take out the wraiths. That was actually a little bit easy, not too bad. When we made our way through the interior, there were all of the brute enemies and those narrow pathways that were a little concerning. There was a high likelihood we would die just falling off. I think Luke even fell off at one point and it was all up to me, and he reminded me all of a sudden that I had invisibility, which doesn't work if you're being shot at. Still, we pushed on. We made our way to the outside section to where Johnson is in the Scarab. We tried to do a despawn where we run backwards woods, and it triggers a deload where all of the wraiths won't spawn in, making Johnson's walk to the end in the scarab much easier. But for whatever reason, even though we tried the deload, we couldn't get it to work this time around. We must have been doing something wrong. So instead, we just tried flying straight to the end, and we hoped for the best. Now, the problem is, flying in the Banshee is incredibly difficult, and it was so tedious trying to just smash the Banshee into the rock walls and hope we were going the right way. I did eventually find that there's a Banshee parked on the bottom level that is facing almost the right direction of where that door opening is that you have to go into at the end of this section. And Luke later respawned on me, and we waited there for Johnson to come along, and for whatever reason, he actually never made it there. Yeah, we just waited there for 20 minutes hoping he'd clear the wraiths on his own. He never came. So we reverted last checkpoint, jumped in the Banshees again, and then realized we'd be better off not being in Banshees and just to take that last Banshee that's already kind of lined up and take the wraiths out on foot, which actually worked out really well. We noticed Johnson was moving up, and we flew the Banshee into the second area. I jokingly thought it'd be funny if I took the Banshee through the destroyed door opening, which actually was incredibly easy at the angle I was in. I was really surprised about that. And we got into the little foyer room where all of the enemies come up and attack. Typically, we try to run past them and get through the door and skip this, but we weren't fast enough because we couldn't turn. So during all this, a lot happened. Luke was struggling the best he could to try to clear all of the enemies in this room, while I was just slamming the Banshee into the walls. But I did slowly find a trick to rotate the Banshee around, where if I quickly did a backflip, jumped out of the Banshee, and jumped back into the Banshee, my character's camera angle would be shifted about 45 degrees, which meant theoretically, with enough trial and error and smashing the Banshee into walls, I could rotate the Banshee again and again and again. And with Tartarus already being a difficult enough boss, trying to find a way to maybe get a little one-up on the competition wouldn't be too bad. Eventually, Luke cleared out all of the enemies. We pushed on to the next area, and Luke went ahead and tried to fight Tartarus. It honestly wasn't going too well. Tartarus is kind of really mean if you're not turning. Meanwhile, I typically was slamming the Banshee into walls, trying to get it to face the right way so I could take a shot at Tartarus, and for the most part, I wasn't really a help at all during any part of the boss fight. However, eventually on maybe our third try on the boss fight, I got a good lineup on Tartarus, and I was able to get some big shots off on Tartarus right after Johnson hit him with a beam rifle, and I think it really benefited in getting Tartarus's health down, and we were able to clear through this level, thus beating Halo 2 without turning. This one was way more intense and challenging than Halo 3's, and I'll be curious to see what happens when we go into some of the other games, like Combat Evolved, an older game that has a lot of close quarter combat, or even a game like ODST that relies more on newer physics like Halo 3, but still at times has you going through a lot of indoor passageways. Be interesting to see how that will play out in the future, but at least we can cross Halo 2 off the list of games completed without turning.